So, in this lesson, we're looking at evidence for evolution. In other words, we know that evolution takes place. We know that things change over time. And one of the ways we can do that is look at the fossil record. As you can see, the skulls down below there. And we find these skulls, we want to know what the relationship is between Australopithecus on the far left to Homo sapiens on the right, and what relationships exist between those. And what evidence would suggest that there is a relationship. So that's really our focus here for the next 10 minutes. Um, when we look at that, then one of the things that I like to bring out is this idea of homologous structures. These are structures that are similar in their features that indicate a common ancestry. So look at the limbs of either my forearm here of the human, which is this area right down here, or the penguin, alligator, and the bat. All of these have similar structures. They're all made up of bones. We know that the penguin's thick humerus here in green is connected to the radius and the ulna in purple and blue. And you can find that same structure with the alligator, the bat, and of course with the human. And then, of course, the other bone structures that we can find in all these species, the carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, which again would indicate that there is some similarity that exists between these vertebrates. And again, from penguins to humans, there's got to be some relations. It might be distant or might be a close ancestral relationship. These are referred to as homologous structures. Homo meaning the same. So the gorilla versus the Australopithecus, again, you can see some of the comparisons resulting here: the skull, the pelvis, the spine, the femur, and the arms. Again, similarities that exist within these, and some of the captions there indicating the specifics of that. For example, with the skull, is a C-shaped spine on the gorilla versus the skull atop the S-shaped spine of the Australopithecines, which is more human-like. Another feature that we use to draw upon, besides homologous structures, are vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are features with no apparent purpose, which may have been useful at a distant ancestor. A common one that we look at, for example, I have that of the whales. Whales have hind limbs. If you look behind here, you can see that there are pelvic bones, but they just don't protrude out of the skin. You'd actually have to remove the skin in order to see them. And the question would be, well, why are they there? It may have served it might have been a useful feature at an earlier time. It's just currently it doesn't serve a function for this particular case of the whale. Human tailbones, the same thing. On the bottom here, you can see that the remains of what appears to be a tail, and even we anatomists call it a tailbone. Again, what is its purpose? If it's removed, what happens? Nothing. We can look at snakes that I have there. Again, the appendages in the back there, just like um, the whale. We oftentimes think of the appendix that's in humans as a vestigial structure. If you've ever known somebody that's had appendicitis, where the appendix has a small blemish or a hole in it, and the bacteria seep out into the abdominal area, that needs to be patched up or removed. More than likely, it's going to be removed. That is also a vestigial structure. Similarities in DNA also give evidence of evolution that takes place, and it's actually some of the best stuff that we have. So if we look at, for example, humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and even like Canis lupus, the dog or the wolf, what similarities do they all have? Well, probably the best way to looking at is the A's, G's, T's, and C's. And so up on top here, I have segments of those, and you can see some of the similarities that are without any of the black markings around it. But you can notice that the Canis lupus here has a C instead of a G. And if you continue down here, it has a C instead of a G here. Again, some of those small segments of DNA that are different and may lead to and do lead to differences in the DNA that is phenotypically expressed. So when comparing DNA sequences between closely related species, The patterns that support this ideas deals with just some slight modifications and mutations that occurred over time. Another number four, another example of how we can look at evolution and some of the evidence for that is the fossil record. It's one of the more classic examples. It's been around for quite some time. We've been exploring the earth and found fossils of organisms that no longer exist today, but are very prevalent in unmasking and looking at the unique structures that these fossils can demonstrate. Whether it's a Tyrannosaurus Rex, like you can see down at the Science Museum, or some of the other fossil remains of fish or plants that, again, you can see down in some of the science museums that are unique and that are kind of special to see. But they show some gradual changes over time. So if we can collect what we would say is a kind of a complete history of that, starting with the recent, for example, horses with their foot, their hind and the forelimbs, even their molar structures up on top, and we compare that to fossils that have been found over time, we'll notice that there is a general pattern that goes from, in this case, the oldest organisms that we found, whether it be molars or the hind and forelimbs. And as you get to the more recent, there are some unique structures that still exist. They've just been modified over time. Now, if we're missing some of these, maybe going from this third proto-hippus to the Pliocene, then potentially we're missing some transitional fossils that would also be helpful in showing the transition over time from these species into some of their new adaptations. One little side note here, in showing you some of the relationships, we look at cladistics as a way of doing that. And it's just a quick summary of showing some of these relationships with certain features. So, cladistics looks at the structures of the fossil record that are considered to be innovations, or newer features that serve some kind of purpose. These characteristics appear in later organisms, so like up here with the leopard, but not on earlier ones that are referred to as derived characters. And so the more derived characters a species has, the further along it has on a cladogram. So, for example, if we look at these features of, for example, a vertebral column, which of these organisms, whether it's a leopard, a turtle, a salamander, tuna, lamprey, or the lancet, has a vertebral column? And we'll notice that all of them have a vertebral column except for the lancet. So that's where the zero comes in. And then all of them will just fill in with a one or an X or a yes, whatever you like to do there. Jaws would be another feature. We see jaws developed in the tuna. And then we see some of the organisms that are walking on land, these four-legged walking structures that the salamander, the turtle, and the leopard all have. So again, we're just showing you the relationship that exists and some of these innovations that allow these organisms to exist. But they all have some similarities, and some of these innovations are differences. I'm going to skip here just a little bit and look at not only some of the evidence of evolution, but also some of the patterns of evolution. One of these patterns is something called coevolution. And this is where these organisms are occurring when one of these species affects the others or evolution of another. And so they're working, like the name implies, co means together. They're working together. And as one develops, it will lead to the development of these innovations, maybe within the corresponding species. So in this case, the Arcadia ants and the Arcadia trees, they're two different species. One's a plant and one's obviously an animal, but they are unique to them in the sense that they need each other at this point, and they are developing together as time goes on. This is referred to as coevolution. Another of these unique patterns in evolution is something called divergent evolution. As you read about with Darwin, Darwin discovered all these bird species on the Galapagos Island. And those bird species had similarities most oftentimes in their beak structure. These beak structures will allow them to not only crack nuts, whether it be large nuts or small nuts, maybe some other plants that they were feeding upon. But this allowed them to, as time rolled on, these differences added up. So, in other words, these different traits, these mutations became favorable under different conditions, whether it's weather or unique islands that these birds were under. And so the population of this finch or these finches became so different that they're no longer referred to just as a particular finch. There is some subgroups of this species, and the differences can be very dramatic, like you can see on the diagram here. Another pattern here that we can see is convergent evolution. If this occurs when species that are not closely related revolve or evolve similar traits because they live in similar environments. One of the classic ones that we can give you is this water environment. A water environment that an organism has particular patterns and shapes, symmetry, like for example with the fins, is an advantage. And what you'll notice is that the shark on your right and the dolphin on your left, two different organisms. One's a mammal and one's a shark. The mammals developed some features on land, we know, and then went back into the ocean or the water environment. And when they did that, they developed some features that are very, very similar to the sharks with the fins and the shape and the body structures. So, again, although these organisms look similar, they are not closely related as the DNA evidence indicates. Another pattern that we look at is something referred to as an analogous structure. An analogous structure, these are features that are similar in appearance or even their function, but don't indicate, again, a close ancestry that's related. So if we look at flight, for example, the birds and butterflies, the bird on the left and the butterfly on the right, very similar structure in order for that organism give lift and for flight for a particular pattern of locomotion. But they're again not closely related. If you look at their DNA, dramatically different as far as their evolutionary development. One of the last ones that I wanted to mention here is artificial selection. Artificial selection is a pattern, and this occurs when humans deliberately select certain characteristics for breeding. In other words, to produce species that are very useful in either agriculture or some personal preferences. The classic example are dogs. Dogs they're all Canis. In other words, they're related to Canis lupus, the wolf on the far left hand side here. But if you look at some of the dogs, whether it be the golden retrievers or the hounds, the pit bulls, the basset hounds. All these dogs are related, and if you look at their DNA, you can see some of the close relationship. However, when the individuals like we would take certain dogs and breed for those with certain traits or characteristics, that's what we're looking for. And so over time, for the last 200 years, we've actually developed several different types of subspecies that are all dogs but have dramatically different characteristics. All right, and the last one some of the patterns that I just wanted to bring out today was something called sexual selection. Sexual selection occurs when members of one gender, usually it's females, choose a mate based on specific traits or behaviors. Birds display this really easily to see. You can see like the plumage of the flamingo and how the male has these elaborate feathers and eye spots versus the female. I wouldn't say she is drab, but she is certainly indicating that she doesn't have the dramatic structures as the male. And so if you look at even size of the buffalo versus an elk, some of those are unique, and that these females are actually choosing their particular mate based on some of these traits and or behaviors or songs for the case of songbirds. And so overall, we say that therefore the females tend to be the pickier ones who choose the mates and actually drive evolution to increase their odds of survival. In other words, they're choosing the best mate, and that the traits that the females are searching for should be an indicator of the overall health and fitness of the male. And that's kind of what we're looking for. So in the end, we looked at evolution and some evidence of evolution and some patterns of this.